Marcus Webb was 39 years old when his mother took her last breath in the house she had paid off with her own hands 41 years before, in a neighborhood in Charlotte called Greer Heights that most people drove through without stopping. To Simone, Marcus was a project manager at an engineering firm, a man with a modest salary, a work truck, and chalk dust on his hands most evenings. He drove a used Silverado. He wore work boots to church on Easter. Her college friends referred to him, without cruelty but without warmth, as a good, steady man. Simone never corrected them. His wife was not at the hospital when Dorothy died. She had extended a spa weekend in Asheville by 2 full days after Marcus called with the news. She arrived home 3 hours before the funeral arrangements were made. Nails freshly done, voice calibrated for consolation, carrying a grief she wore the way people wear something borrowed, carefully, and only for the occasion. 2 years before Dorothy Webb's death, during an argument about Thanksgiving plans that turned into something uglier, Simone had looked across their kitchen at Marcus and said, flat as poured concrete, that his mother was dead to her. Not in anger, an announcement. The way people say things they have rehearsed privately for too long and finally decide to release. Marcus stood very still. He said nothing. He looked at her and made a note. What Simone had never once thought to ask, not in 11 years of marriage, was what Dorothy Webb had been doing with all those years of quiet. A woman who cleaned other people's houses for 2 decades and then managed a cleaning service of 12 employees had not been spending. She had been building. Deliberately, without announcement. The way she did everything. The estate had been fully appraised and placed into a legally irrevocable family trust 14 months before Dorothy's diagnosis turned terminal. Total documented value, $1.4 million. Every asset classified as Marcus's separate property under North Carolina statute, explicitly excluded from any marital estate, on language his mother had personally requested. It was not Simone's name anywhere on it. 3 days after the funeral, in Dorothy's living room with family and witnesses present, Simone would read the first page of a document, and her knees would give out from under her. She had written off the wrong woman. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from, and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The morning light came through the blinds of Marcus Webb's home office in Charlotte, the way it did every morning in late September, long and angled and unhurried. Crossing the drafting table where he had been working since before 5, he was a structural engineer. He had built his firm from 2 employees to 14 over 7 years, a company that handled commercial and residential structural work across the Carolinas, whose clients had learned by reputation alone that Marcus Webb's calculations did not fail. Not once. Not in 11 professional years. He kept the office the way he kept everything. Ordered, clean, without ornament. 1 mug of coffee, black. A mechanical pencil set parallel to the edge of the table. On the corner shelf, a framed photograph of his mother taken in her garden the previous summer. Her hands in worn garden gloves. Her eyes looking past the camera with the expression of a woman fully at peace with everything she had made. His mother had told him once, when he was 10 years old and had drawn his first building on graph paper with a school ruler, that load-bearing walls didn't look like much from the outside. But everything rested on them. He had spent 30 years learning how right she was. Simone moved through their mornings with the ease of someone who had rehearsed the role well. She kissed his cheek before finishing her coffee. She asked about his projects in Concord with well-placed interest, the kind of question that performed curiosity without requiring a real answer. Her phone sat on the counterface up until it wasn't, and then it was in her hand and turned slightly to the side, and Marcus noted it the way he noted everything. without urgency, without conclusion yet. Filed. She was beautiful. That had never stopped being true. She had walked into a zoning hearing in uptown Charlotte 9 years ago in a linen blazer, reading a development report with focused attention, and he had found a reason to introduce himself before the session adjourned. She was a commercial real estate analyst then, direct, organized, the kind of person whose questions were sharper than their answers. Their first few years together had been real. The house on Belmont Avenue. The Saturday mornings. The conversations that went somewhere worth going. He had checked his math on them. He had believed what the numbers told him. He still could not trace exactly when the tilt began. His second phone, a line registered under his engineering firm's holding company, known only to his attorney and his CPA, stayed in the inner pocket of his field jacket, where it had lived for 3 years. Simone had seen the jacket dozens of times. She had never asked about the phone. She had made her determination about what Marcus Webb was worth and had not revisited the calculation. The previous spring, while repairing his mother's back porch, tongue and groove decking, pressure treated, sealed in the cedar stain Dorothy had picked out herself from a hardware store sample sheet, he had installed a wireless doorbell camera on her front porch at her request. She asked for it while watching him work, the way his mother asked for things she had already thought through. For when she wasn't expecting company, she said. He hadn't thought much about it since. The trouble came on a Wednesday. He was back at Dorothy's house finishing the cedar ceiling when his personal phone rang. Miss Eunice, Dorothy's neighbor of 40 years, 73 years old. The woman who had watched Marcus grow up through that kitchen window since he was 6. She told him to come by when Simone wasn't with him. There was something his mother would want him to know before the time came. He set down his brush. He cleaned his hands the way his mother had taught him, one finger at a time, with patience, because the work was in the details. "I'll be there by noon," he said. Miss Eunice had a manila folder and skipped the greeting entirely. She set it on Dorothy's kitchen table and sat across from it like a woman who had been holding something too long. The folder held a handwritten letter in Dorothy's careful, pressed script, written before her voice gave out. Behind it, the notarized family trust, executed 14 months prior. A property appraisal document, a summary letter from estate attorney Gerald Sutton on East Trade Street, whose name Marcus recognized, and a personal note clipped to the final page in his mother's hand. 4 words: "You were the wall." He read each document in order. His hands didn't shake. The trust named Marcus Webb as sole beneficiary. The Greer Heights home, appraised at $487,000, a duplex in Noda she had purchased quietly in 2008 for $89,000 and never mentioned to a living soul, not even to him. 2 parcels of land outside Concord inherited from Dorothy's own mother and held untouched for 31 years. Investment accounts across 3 institutions totaling $381,000. Total estate value, $1.4 million. Everything classified as Marcus's separate property under North Carolina General Statute. Language precise, protection irrevocable, marital claim excluded by explicit provision that Dorothy had personally dictated. His face remained perfectly calm. He had not known about the duplex. He had not known about the land. He had known his mother was careful with money the way serious people are careful with anything that matters, habitually, completely, without announcement. But he had not known the scope of what she had built while everyone who thought they knew her had decided she was simply a woman who cleaned things. Miss Eunice folded her hands and told him the rest. 3 weeks before Dorothy's final hospitalization, Simone had come to the house alone, a Tuesday afternoon. Dorothy was not up for company. Simone had come inside anyway and begun asking questions about the property, about ownership, about whether a will existed. Dorothy had told her nothing. She had called Miss Eunice that night. Word for word, that girl is circling. Make sure Marcus knows what belongs to him. He opened his phone. He found the doorbell camera application he had all but forgotten since spring. He found Tuesday, September 3rd. There was Simone arriving at 2:14 in the afternoon, alone, in a car he had not seen before. He watched her knock. He watched his mother open the door and hold the frame. He watched Simone smile the way she smiled when she wanted something. He watched her step inside. 41 minutes later, she walked out with nothing in her hands and something in her expression that Marcus recognized now for what it was. Not grief. Not concern. Disappointment. He moved with the same deliberate calm that defined all his actions. He pulled up the joint account transaction history and scrolled back 8 months, reading the pattern the way he reads structural load calculations. With discipline, without rush, one figure at a time. 8 transfers to an external account he did not recognize. Spread across 20 weeks, between $1,200 and $4,800. Always on a Friday. Always labeled personal savings. $24,400. Moved while his mother was in declining health. He photographed every document in the folder. He emailed copies to his company address. He took a separate photograph of his mother's handwritten note. He thanked Miss Eunice with the same quiet respect he brought to every room that deserved it, and walked out to his truck. He sat in the driveway for a moment, not struggling, not grieving, calculating. Then he opened his phone and called Gerald Sutton's office. "Gerald," he said, when the line connected. "This is Marcus Webb, Dorothy's son. I need to meet with you before the service. Can you make time tomorrow morning?" Gerald Sutton's office was on the 14th floor of a building whose structural drawings Marcus had signed and stamped in 2016. He noted this when he stepped off the elevator and said nothing about it. Gerald was 61 and silver-haired, with the careful stillness of a man who had spent 4 decades drafting documents for families who could not afford expensive mistakes. He stood when Marcus walked in and pointed to the chair already pulled out. He walked Marcus through the trust, layer by layer. The irrevocable structure. The spendthrift protection. The separate property classification under North Carolina statute. A specific clause directing any legal dispute to be heard before Judge Calvin Reeves in Mecklenburg County, a judge Gerald had known for 22 years. The individual provisions Dorothy had personally dictated, reviewed, and signed. Gerald turned to a final page and explained that Dorothy had left one additional written instruction. The trust summary was to be read aloud at the repast, at her house, in front of family and witnesses, on the day of the funeral. "She wrote it down 18 months ago," Gerald said. "She told me she wanted it documented in public so there would be no confusion about it later." He looked at Marcus over the edge of his glasses. "Your mother was thorough." Marcus allowed himself the first quiet exhale he'd had in 4 days. Gerald connected him to Patricia Crane on Providence Road, asset recovery, family law, a practice built precisely on situations like this one. Marcus met with her 2 mornings later. She reviewed the bank transaction summary, the trust documents, and the doorbell camera screenshot before she removed her reading glasses and set them flat on the desk. She transferred $24,400 while her mother-in-law was still breathing, Patricia said. "That is not marital savings. That is intelligence gathering." She paused. "Tell me about Terrence Okafor." Marcus had been expecting that name. Terrence was a commercial real estate broker, a contact from Simone's prior firm, visible, confident, the kind of man whose lifestyle consistently outpaced his documented income by a margin that only made sense if someone else was intended to close the gap. He drove a charcoal Land Rover. He held a penthouse condo in Midtown, whose carrying costs had required a commission income he had not publicly achieved in 2 consecutive fiscal years. He and Simone had been in regular contact for 8 months, weekday contact, the kind that shifted routines in small ways that did not add up structurally once you laid them end to end. Patricia had already run the public record, 2 civil judgments from a prior business dispute, a 2021 fraud complaint settled out of court, a pattern of prior associations with married women in the industry referenced obliquely in 2 professional departures. He was leveraged forward and had identified, or believed he had identified, a path to stability that ran through what he had decided Marcus Webb represented, a modest man with a modest firm and a marriage that was already being vacated from the inside. He thought he was stepping into something, Marcus said. He thought you were a salaried man with a joint account and chalk on his hands, Patricia replied. He never looked for the second room. She closed the folder. Real power operated in quiet rooms. He had no idea there was one. She had already drafted the divorce filing. Marcus authorized it that afternoon with one instruction on timing. The papers were to be served at the repast, at Dorothy's house, on the same day Gerald read the trust. Gerald had already confirmed the date. Dorothy had approved it in writing, in a sealed letter Gerald kept in his client file from 18 months prior. Some things, he thought, were completed before they began. 3 days passed. That Friday evening he came home and cooked dinner. Salmon and roasted sweet potato, Simone's preferences. He set the table. He poured wine. He asked about her week and listened to her describe a South Park listing and a difficult client, and a fall market cooling in ways she didn't like. She laughed at something he said about load-bearing columns. She touched his arm when she refilled her glass. She had no idea what was already sitting in Gerald Sutton's leather folder. He washed the pan the way his mother had taught him, with care, without resentment, because the pan had done nothing wrong. Preparation was the work. The rest was only delivery. Dorothy Webb's funeral service was held on a Thursday morning at 2nd Calvary Baptist Church on Beatties Ford Road, where she had been a member for 37 years. The sanctuary was full. Former clients of her cleaning service, grown now with children who had known her as the woman who showed up in pressed clothes and left things better than she found them. The choir sang the 2 hymns she had chosen herself. The pastor read the psalm she had underlined in her own Bible. Simone sat in the front pew beside Marcus and performed her grief with precision. He bore it without comment. The repast was held at Dorothy's house. Miss Eunice and 2 women from the church had organized it, and by noon the rooms were full of food and the layered sound of people who had genuinely loved someone. His Aunt Clara, 64, who had driven from Memphis and had known Dorothy since before Marcus was born, sat near the back of the dining room with her arms folded and tracked Simone's movements through the house with the expression of a woman who had been keeping her mouth shut for a very long time and was nearly finished doing so. Simone moved through the repast with careful warmth, touching shoulders, receiving condolences, performing a grief that Marcus had stopped looking beneath. He watched her pause near the hallway when Gerald Sutton arrived at 1:30 in a dark suit with his leather folder. He watched her assess him. He watched her recalibrate. She found Marcus near the kitchen doorway and asked quietly who the man was. "My mother's estate attorney," Marcus said. "She left instructions for this to happen today. In this room." He watched her adjust. A small, almost imperceptible straightening of posture. The arithmetic running behind her eyes, Gerald waited until the plates had been cleared and the room had settled into the natural quiet of a gathering that had finished its primary business. He stood near the doorway to the living room and asked for everyone's attention. He introduced himself. He explained that Dorothy Webb had left written instructions, notarized and dated, requesting the trust summary be read aloud in the presence of family and witnesses on this date. Her words, her request, her timing. He opened the folder. He read the summary in full. The assets. The property classifications. The statutory language. The irrevocable structure. The sole beneficiary designation. He read the total estate value clearly and without ceremony. $1.4 million. He read the separate property clause in its entirety, including the specific provision excluding every asset from any marital claim, regardless of the duration or standing of the marriage. The room held a silence that had weight. He then withdrew a personal copy, 3 stapled pages, and crossed the room to where Simone stood near the far wall. He held it out to her directly. "Your courtesy copy," he said. "Your attorney is welcome to review the originals at my office." Simone took it. She read the first page. Her eyes moved down the document with the focused efficiency of a woman who had spent her career in commercial real estate and understood what she was reading. She turned to the second page. The color began leaving her face the way light leaves a room at the end of day, in one slow, total process. She turned to the third page and found the clause that named Marcus as the sole beneficiary of every documented asset, in language that offered no adjacent interpretation, no alternate reading, no room. She looked up. Patricia Crane stepped forward from the hallway. She was holding a sealed envelope. She crossed the room and set it on the side table in front of Simone without a word. Simone looked at it. She looked at Marcus. She looked at Gerald. She looked at the envelope. She opened it. She read the filing header, his name, her name, the date, the petition. Her hand went to her mouth. The color that remained in her face left all at once. She made a sound that was not quite a word, and her knees buckled, and her own mother, who had driven up from Greensboro and had been watching from near the dining room doorway, with an expression that had not been entirely surprised since the moment Gerald walked in, caught her before she reached the floor and eased her down into the nearest chair. The room was still. Aunt Clara did not move. She nodded once, slowly, the way people nod when something they have known in their bones for years is finally confirmed in open air. Marcus picked up his field jacket from the coat rack near the door. He put it on. He buttoned the single button. He stood for a long moment and looked at Simone, not in anger, not in satisfaction, with the quiet of an engineer who has checked a completed structure and found every number exactly where he placed it. "My mother worked 40 years building something real," he said. "Load-bearing work. The kind that holds everything else up while nobody's watching. You looked at her and decided she was nothing worth knowing." He paused. "She built more in that silence than you ever thought to look for. And she left every single piece of it to me." He walked out of the house that now belonged entirely to him, documented, protected, legally undeniable, into the October afternoon. The door settled closed behind him the way well-hung doors do, quietly, without drama, with precision. He did not look back. 7 months later, the work was settled. Marcus had moved into his mother's house in Greer Heights that winter and renovated the kitchen himself over the cold months. Honed granite in the color Dorothy had torn from a magazine years ago and never gotten to ordering, the cabinets stripped and restained in walnut. He planted a Japanese maple in the corner of the backyard where her vegetable garden used to be, in the spot she had knelt in every spring for 30 years. The tree was 18 inches high and leaning toward the morning light, which was exactly what young things were supposed to do when they were growing right. His firm had completed a commercial development contract in Noda that fall worth $890,000. A project built in part on land that had been in his mother's name for 3 decades, without a soul outside the family knowing it. He had hired 2 additional engineers and taken on a mentorship arrangement with a young structural engineering student at UNC Charlotte, whose precision reminded him of his own beginning, when everything was still being drawn and nothing had failed yet. He had begun preliminary plans for a community development project in the Greer Heights neighborhood that had lived in the back of his mind for 4 years and could now, finally, be built. A woman named Renee had come into his life the way good things tended to come, without announcement, without performance. She was a hospital administrator who had grown up 3 neighborhoods over, who asked questions that were actually questions, who sat on his new porch deck one evening in April and looked at the Japanese maple and said only, "Your mother had good taste," and left it there. She was not the center of anything yet, but she was present, and she was real. What reached Marcus about Simone came through Aunt Clara, who had her own channels and reported without embellishment. The divorce had been finalized in March. The $24,400 in transferred funds had been returned with penalty interest as a condition of the settlement, at Patricia's instruction. Simone had been terminated from her new position following a licensing complaint filed by a former colleague, a complaint that referenced a pattern of misrepresented transactions going back 4 years in 2 firms. She was living in an apartment in Rock Hill. She had not spoken publicly about the marriage or its end, which Patricia attributed to the non-disclosure agreement and to the simpler fact that there was nothing in the story that served Simone to tell. Terrence Okafor had relocated to Atlanta. His midtown condo had sold at a loss in 10 days. He had not returned to the Charlotte market. On a morning in early May, Marcus sat on his mother's porch with his coffee and his plans for the Noda renovation and the quiet of a neighborhood coming awake in the light. The Japanese maple was catching the sun at its highest branch. He thought about his mother. He thought about load-bearing walls, the ones nobody looked at directly, the ones that held the whole weight of everything visible, the ones that did their work in the dark interior of a structure where no one thought to look. He thought about 40 years of quiet building. He thought about what that building had protected and ultimately delivered in the end. He was solvent. He was clear. He was unbothered. He had built everything worth keeping. Some things, he thought, were worth the patience to build right. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.